The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew. Glory to you, Lord Christ. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized the slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ.
It was, if I remember correctly, April or May of 1986. And Jan and I were living in Hinsdale, where I was serving as the younger associate at Grace Church in that town. We had a 6-month-old, Jeremy, our first child, and we decided, somewhat uncharacteristically, to invite for dinner my predecessor in the position as associate at Grace Church, his wife, and their perhaps 8-year-old daughter. This is a Friday night, have them down for dinner. Jan had the challenge of making a wonderful meal with this little person always holding on to her, as well as fighting the challenges of one of the world's worst kitchens in this awful converted coach house we lived in. But somehow she put together this wonderful meal, and 6 o'clock, the appointed hour for the dinner, arrived, but no guests. Okay, 6:10, 6:15. I thought, okay, well, they're just being, fashionably late. And then 6:30. And then 7:30. No phone call, weren't answering their phone. So finally, about 8 o'clock, we said, well, the heck with this. And we called our best friends who lived just a couple towns west out in Downers Grove and said, guys, come on over. We got this food. Maybe the casserole's a little dry by now. The salad might be a little soggy, but come on over. Let's just have a party. And they did. These two friends of ours were sitting there eating and drinking, and then, I can't remember, probably 8:45, the doorbell rings. And it's our original guest showing up almost 3 hours late. No apology. No explanation, just assumed that we were going to be able 3 hours late to provide them with a sumptuous feast, which somehow Jan did, I might add. The point is that dinner parties, receptions, wedding receptions, they hardly ever go exactly as we think they're going to, do they? I mean, you've all thrown parties, you've certainly been to them. I mean, the caterer doesn't prepare enough canapes, or people you expect to show up don't, or people you don't expect or maybe didn't invite come. That happened at our wedding, by the way. Or somebody shows up inebriated. You always wonder, will these two dinner partners get along, or are they going to get into politics, and that would not be pretty. I mean, something, it seems, always goes wrong at a party reception. And to be honest, isn't that half the fun? Not being quite sure what's going to happen, not having complete and utter control over absolutely everything. I mean, that gives it a little bit of energy and juice. How much fun would life be if everything went exactly as we expect it to? Well, in our gospel today, of course, we hear about the worst possible scenario for a party. This is now the fifth parable that Jesus has told in rapid succession about what the kingdom of heaven is like. You remember the stage. He is in the final days of his life. He has entered the holy city on what we call Palm Sunday. He has offended the religious leaders. And now in his final parable, he is trying to tell not only those religious leaders, but others who've gathered what the kingdom of heaven is like. And he tells this rather remarkable, unique, troubling parable about the king who throws a wedding banquet for one of his children and sends out the invitation and says, the food is ready, the fatted calf is prepared, the wine has been chilled, time to come. And you remember what happens? That they kind of ignore, the guests kind of ignore the invitation, and so the king tries again, sends out the same servants to summon the guests to the banquet, and this time, some go off to deal with their business concerns, one guy goes off to his farm, we're told, but then some of them actually put to death the servants who are giving them the invitation. That's a little extreme. I don't think any of us would actually slay the postman for delivering a wedding invitation, would we? And so what happens, the king is a little miffed, and he sends his troops out to kill all the people who are invited and to lay waste to their villages and towns. And I'm thinking to myself, how are you going to keep the pot roast warm while you're doing that? But then he says, of course, the servants go out, go back again, invite everybody. Go down to the main streets, go down the highways, the byways, look in the shrubbery, invite anybody in. And everybody comes. So it's a peculiar story, isn't it? It's not a particularly comfortable parable. It doesn't present the king in the best of light, and we're not done with the story yet. But it is a reminder to us of how frequently the image of a feast, of a banquet, of a celebration is used throughout the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian tradition. Think about it. Even our first lesson today, Isaiah, speaking to the people of Israel on God's behalf, says that on the holy mountain of God, God is going to prepare a feast like nothing you ever saw, of fine wines, of food fat with marrow. I'm hungry just standing here. And says that on that day, God will wipe away the tears from all faces, and all people, the word all is used 5 times in just 3 verses, all people will be invited to the holy mount. Think about how often God has fed God's people, going back to our very first parents in the Garden of Eden when God provided them with the food they needed, or the way in which God fed the people of Israel as they wandered in the wilderness, having left slavery in Egypt, and God provided manna and then quail, then water from the rock. Think about the water turned into wine at Cana, the finest wine possible. Think about all the times that God has provided physical nourishment, leave aside spiritual and emotional. And of course, all of it leading to the feast we celebrate together, that we will enjoy this morning. Again and again and again, this image of heaven as a banquet, and of our earthly banquets and meals and Eucharist being a foretaste of that vision that Isaiah articulates again and again and again, we are told. Come. The doors are open. And also think of the people who responded to Jesus' message, to Jesus' ministry and his very being. Think about the leper who threw himself at Jesus' feet, beseeching him to bring about healing and wholeness, and that's exactly what Jesus does. Think about the Syrophoenician woman who is somewhat irreligious, whose daughter is sick, and Jesus heals her. Think about the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the outcasts and the sinners who come and dine with Jesus at his invitation. Again and again, the people who respond to the invitation, the people who respond to the summons represent the widest possible spectrum of human society. Not the elite, not those who are cute or clever, but all people. So Jesus' own ministry reflects this wide embracing, this all-embracing invitation of God. But then we get the very end of the parable. when things get even uglier, perhaps. When the king, we are told, comes in and he sees all these guests who have been invited at the last minute, who have come, and he sees the one guy standing over by the orchestra in a plaid shirt and a pair of striped pants, who's not wearing the right attire. And he said, "Friend, how'd you get in here without a wedding gown?" Well, first of all, I think that's really unfair of the king, okay? I mean, how many of us walk around with tuxedos or formal dresses, in the trunk at any given moment? But then he casts that character out into the outer darkness. And what's the story? What's the message there for us? Well, I think it's simply that having been invited to the feast, having accepted the invitation, there is then incumbent upon us the expectation that we will respond with lives that reflect and are appropriate to the feast. I mean, isn't it true that quite often we live our lives as people of faith as if we were asleep during the Sermon on the Mount? How often are we unwilling to relinquish old angers or fears or resentments? How often are we unwilling to be forgiven or to forgive others? How often are we unwilling or resistant to seeing the holiness in each other, to respecting the dignity of every human being? It's not just enough to come. There's an expectation on behalf of the host that we will then live lives that reflect the gift, the celebration, the feast. And the truth is, quite often when the invitation is given, we, like the original guests in the story today, are sometimes simply busy, sometimes distracted, and not always with bad things. I mean, you heard that one of the fellows had to go to his farm, others had to deal with their business concerns. Sometimes it's the good that gets in the way of the sublime. Sometimes we're so busy making a living that we forget to make a life. And being invited to the feast, sharing in the celebration, being included in God's family means that we need to live into who we already are. The invitations have been sent. The food has been prepared. The doors are open. Feast.